deputies and senators of the National Congress, governors, ministers of the Supreme Court of Justice of the nation, ambassadors and those who accompany us today in this room. We meet here, as the national constitution states, to communicate the state of our nation to all the Argentine people who are watching us throughout the length and breadth of the country. Today marks exactly 83 days since we took on the challenge of leading the nation in what is possibly the most critical economic moment in its history. After more than 100 years of insisting on an impoverishing model and having almost completely forgotten the ideas that made our country great, the last 20 years have been, particularly, an economic disaster, an orgy of public spending, uncontrolled issuance, which resulted in the worst inheritance that any government in Argentine history has ever received. In fact, the twin deficits that we inherited reached 17 percentage points of GDP. Many of the economic data we inherited are public, from day one when we took over the country. 5 points of GDP of fiscal deficit in the Treasury and 10 points of quasi-fiscal deficit, generated by the central bank, adding up to a total of 15 points of consolidated deficit. Also a huge debt with importers and multilateral credit organizations, which left us on the verge of default. Negative net reserves in the central bank for $11.2 billion. Prices of transport and energy repressed, in some cases, up to a fifth of their real value, and the dollar with a gap of 200% between the official and the parallel. An unbridled emission. In the last years of government, of 13 points of GDP, added to the more than 15 points of GDP, which had been issued during the first 3 years of government. In turn, during the first week of December, retail inflation ran at a rate of 3,700% annually. During the second, it accelerated to 7,500% annually. While, for those who consider these numbers to be fantasy, the 52% monthly wholesale inflation implied an annual inflation of 17,000%. These were numbers that fit perfectly with the monetary surplus and the emission potential derived from the remunerated liabilities of the BCRA. I understand that some politicians have difficulty adding, unless it is their own. Therefore, asking them to compute a geometric growth function is an oxymoron for those who have not seen it. Do not see it and will not see it. None of this is new. However, the disaster does not end there, because as we audit the national public administration and some lagging symptoms of the economic chaos that they left us begin to materialize, we are getting to know in greater depth the size of the crisis that we inherited. A crisis that is present in all dimensions of the life of society. Perhaps the starkest indicator of the legacy we have received was recently revealed when it was revealed that nearly 60% of Argentines are below the poverty line. However, for some it seems that poverty has appeared overnight. I tell you that real wages are the result of marginal labor productivity and that this is determined by the accumulation of capital. Therefore, the much-mentioned phrase, fighting capital, is detrimental to investment, reduces the stock of capital per inhabitant and, as a consequence, real wages. This madness to which populism has led us has caused the average wage, in dollars, at the parallel exchange rate, because the price is the one that exists, to be $300. When in the 1990s it had reached $1,800, which in today's currencies would be $3,000. That is, populism took away 90% of our income, reaching a level of madness such that a third of formal workers are poor. This is a heartbreaking fact, which crudely reveals the brutality of the inheritance we have received and the ravages that the famous model of the present state has produced. From being the richest country in the world, when we embraced the ideas of freedom, to being a country where 6 out of 10 Argentines are poor, while the majority of politicians, like many of you, are rich. To this tragedy of poverty, which has multiplied by 10 in the last 50 years. Social debts and deep problems in all dimensions of Argentine life are added as additional problems. A society with record numbers of indigents and that, at the same time, never in its history has distributed so much social assistance as now, where a good part of that assistance works as war spoils for leftist organizations that steal money from those they claim to defend and attack those they claim to defend. A society with record numbers of indigents and that, at the same time, never in its history has distributed so much social assistance as now, where a good part of that assistance works as spoils of war for leftist organizations that steal money from those they claim to defend and attack those who produce it. We are a society with a labor market where the formal private sector is frozen, which, as a result of rigidity and its high labor costs, has not produced a single new job for 12 years. While public employment and informal work are the only ones that are growing. And as if that were not enough, we have a broken pension system, which costs less and less income every day in proportion to its expenses, and which, in the last 10 years, has incorporated almost 4 million beneficiaries without contributions, through moratoriums that are a moral affront to all those who have fulfilled their responsibility throughout their lives. Retirees, victims of this legacy, continue to be tied to a formula that we wanted to change because it pulverizes their income in a regime of high inflation due to the previous government, and that if it were not for the discretionary recomposition of the bonuses that we are carrying out, would have resulted in a loss of up to 40% of their purchasing power. In fact, the recurrent use of compensatory bonuses is a clear example of how poorly designed the formula is, and that it needs to be modified urgently so that retirees are not victims of the misdeeds of politics. In terms of security, we find ourselves with a society abandoned to its fate, entire cities held hostage by drug trafficking, the streets taken over by chaos and disorder, both generated by leftist organizations in their eagerness to constantly extort the different governments, a chaos that politics has fueled for its own benefit over the last 20 years. Faced with this, security forces mistreated and trampled by previous governments, who tied their hands and prevented them from doing their job, siding with criminals, exemplified by the absurdity of releasing prisoners during the pandemic. As far as education is concerned, a crisis that has dragged on for decades, which is getting deeper and deeper, and which has resulted in the fact that, today, half of the children in third grade in Argentina do not understand what they read, and 70% cannot solve a basic math problem. This is the reality of a country with the most Nobel Prize winners in the region, which was once a beacon of quality in education. Incipient illiteracy is to our education what inflation is to our economy. In the field of higher education, the creation of universities has become another political business, and left-wing educational curricula, openly anti-capitalist and anti-liberal, are proliferating in the teaching staff and teacher training institutes. In a country where what is most needed is more capitalism and more freedom. In terms of health, there is a system pushed towards a crisis of shortages, caused by the irresponsible commercial policy of the previous government, which left doctors, patients and families without stock of medical supplies of all kinds and, in particular, of special medicines such as oncological ones. All this in the middle of the farce of "the state takes care of you" during the pandemic, where if we had done things like a non-mediocre country we would have had 30,000 deaths, for real, while we had 130,000 with the enormous pain that this means. That is, they sold us the idea that the state works as an insurance, but in real life, when the disaster occurs, it defaults. In technical terms, this happens when they steal the bonus, as it can be, from a state that does everything very badly. In terms of defense, we inherited an army that is underfunded and even discredited by the state itself. Without the resources or the preparation to face the challenges of a world in constant change and increasingly far from peace. And as if that were not enough, this national debacle is leading us more and more to irrelevance in the concert of nations, making us incapable of protecting our own territory and forcing us to grovel before the most questioned countries in the world. This is the reality that was left to us, who are by right in history one of the most important countries in the world. A country that, 120 years ago, had one of the 3 highest GDP per capita in the world and received immigrants from all corners of the planet. Behind all these evils we find an inoperative, bankrupt national state that cannot even fulfill its basic functions, a state that does everything and does everything badly, causing harm in every aspect of social life in which it interferes. As Milton Friedman pointed out, nothing good can be expected from the state. According to the father of monetarism, there are 4 ways to spend. One can spend one's own money on oneself or on others, while the same can be done with the money of others. Thus, the best way to spend one's own money is on oneself, since one knows what one wants and how much it costs to earn it. In other words, the benefit is maximized. On the other hand, when one spends one's own money on other people, the cost is minimized. While when one spends the money of others on oneself, one falls into waste. Therefore, it follows from this that there is no worse way to spend than spending the money of others on others. Precisely what the state does. That is why the more state there is, the greater the waste and the less well-being for good Argentines. The situation report of the 114 national public administration agencies, carried out by SIGEN and the State Transformation Secretariat, has revealed alarming information, including a consolidated debt of nearly $3 billion in unpaid goods and services, a state that not only does not control, but what it controls poorly. Designed not to fulfill its basic functions, but to generate a kiosk in every place, wherever possible, for the benefit of the bureaucrat on duty. Perhaps the insurance case, which we have recently seen in the media, is the best example of this, since it was a system designed to create an intermediary between the different state agencies in order to collect returns on each operation. A corrupt system that has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in returns, which ended up in the pockets of politicians. This is perhaps the best definition we can give of the situation in which we have found the state, a criminal organization designed so that in every permit, in every regulation, in every procedure and in every operation there is a bribe for the politician in charge. This rotten scheme is extended to all the powers of the state, both the executive power, the legislative power and the judicial power, and at all its levels, national, provincial and municipal, supported by the media, which live off official guidelines and opinion makers in envelopes, who look the other way or who carefully choose who to accuse and who not. Also supported by prebendary businessmen, who support this model because, in return for paying a bribe, it is more tempting than the challenge of competing in the market, also by unionists who give away their workers, deceiving them with supposed benefits, while promoting a labor regime which only benefits them. That is, a system in absolute moral bankruptcy and intrinsically unjust. A system that can only generate poor people and at the cost of that produces a privileged caste, who live as if they were monarchs, who reach obscene absurdities of impunity, such as, for example, what we experienced this week when we learned that a former governor put a citizen behind bars without due process for 50 days, merely for the crime of speaking ill of the crown in a private chat. The silence of those who call themselves Republicans is offensive. In case it was not heard by the applause, the silence of those who call themselves Republicans is offensive. After having seen with my own eyes and in detail the vulgarity of the waste with which politics has become accustomed to living, I confirm once again that it is not a matter of incompetence. That a system that does so much harm to so many people is not a coincidence, the disaster in which we have been submerged. It is a conscious and planned scheme. It is what I call the caste model. There is a close relationship between the privileges of politics and the discontent of ordinary Argentines. It is precisely the economic model of the current state, a regime of high public spending, fiscal deficit, debt and monetary emission. The system that the political caste uses to expropriate wealth from good Argentines and give it to their clients and friends. In this system, what is at the base of the deterioration is widespread in the last 100 years, the construction of a facade, a business protected by lies. This is the lamentable material and spiritual state of our nation. We have been denouncing this model to society for many years. And just over 3 months ago, after 100 years of gradual decline and more than a decade of free fall into misery, a silent majority raised its voice. That silent majority that is made up of those who work, those who produce. The rural workers who get up at 4 in the morning, those who run a business, the self-employed, the informal worker. The young person who cannot find work and the housewives who have the enormous task of educating our future generations. A silent majority of unprotected Argentine citizens, who were not invited to sit at the table of power, where the country's course was always defined. That Argentina woke up, went to the polls and put in the presidency a man who has just arrived in political life, who leads a new political force, who may not have parliamentary majorities or mayors or governors. But who knows what he has to do, knows how to do it and has the conviction to do it. A president who may not have the power of politics, but who has the power of conviction and the support of millions of Argentines who want a real change. Because as the sacred scriptures say in the book of Maccabees, and which is commemorated in the holiday of Hanukkah, victory in war does not depend on the number of soldiers, but on the forces that come from heaven. "35 years ago, in his first State of the Nation address, President Carlos Saul Menem said that the courage of a people is not only proven on the battlefield or when facing misfortunes, but is also proven by the number of truths it is capable of enduring. He was speaking to the Argentine people, in a context with some economic similarities to the current one, urging them to make difficult decisions, similar to those I am having to make today. During the electoral campaign, we spoke to the Argentine people with the truth for the first time in decades. And the people understood, accepted and elected us. Even though there were other candidates who promised the same old solutions, repeating the same old conciliatory and deceptive speech. For the first time in a long time, society elected the candidate who preferred to tell an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable lie. We proposed to society that the only way to avoid a worse economic catastrophe would be with a brutal and rapid adjustment of public spending. We also proposed to society that the correction of repressed prices and lagging inflation, the product of monetary emission, would generate months of very high inflation, and also that cleaning up the shattered economy that we inherited would imply sacrifice and pain, and it would take time to get out of the hole. We signed an electoral contract of effort and sacrifice, because 100 years of decline cannot be reversed overnight. But at the same time, we made a commitment to the Argentines that the effort would be worth it, because doing so would allow us to meet two objectives. First, it would allow us to end inflation forever and advance structural reforms so that Argentina becomes a prosperous and thriving country again. Second, it would allow us to end the political apartheid regime that has existed in Argentina for decades. A regime in which politicians and their friends are first-class citizens and good Argentines are second-class citizens. For this reason, due to the mandate for change that the people gave us and with the endorsement of having told the truth and nothing but the truth during the campaign, during our first 82 days in office we have carried out the most ambitious government program in living memory. On the economic level, we began by destroying the snake's egg, the fiscal deficit. We have made progress in the most profound reduction of public spending in our history, making a cut of 5 points of GDP in just 1 month. We reduced the primary spending of the national state by 40% in real terms, where this result arose from eliminating public works, reducing 98% of transfers to the provinces, reducing the ministries by half, firing phantom public employees, eliminating social plans for people who did not need them, ending the intermediaries of poverty and reducing the fleet of cars, advisors and cell phones to a minimum. In other words, although there has been liquefaction, there has been much more chainsaw, all for politics. In short, it is an adjustment that has been carried out mostly on the national public sector and not as it has always been done, increasing taxes and placing all the burden on the private sector. As you may not have heard people say, in the last 123 years, Argentina had a fiscal deficit in 112 of them. The fiscal deficit and the fight against high tax pressure are for us the mother of all battles. They are the cause of poverty and stagnation in the last 100 years. After decades of government that squandered the money of taxpayers, Argentina once again has a government that will take care of each one of the pesos that Argentines pay with work and sweat. Second, we avoided the default with the IMF and other multilateral organizations in which we were going to fall 11 days after taking office. Third, we cut the monetary emission that is the only and proven cause of inflation. And through an ambitious financial program we are moving forward with the cleanup of the central bank's balance sheet. In fact, since we came to power, we have bought nearly $9 billion in the market, where despite this issue, the execution of puts against the BCRA and the payment of interest on remunerated liabilities, the contraction by BOPREAL and the fiscal adjustment, we have managed to keep the monetary base constant. That is, for the same monetary base in pesos, Today we have 9 billion additional reserves that cover more than 90% of it. Not only that, the monetary base that during the 21st century has been around 9% of GDP, today only represents 3%. While if you consider the broad version, something only feasible in a furious crisis of confidence, it is in line with the historical average. Therefore, in the last month the price of the parallel dollar has plummeted. The gap with the import dollar corrected by the country tax has disappeared and the dollar futures have aligned with the guidelines established by the BCRA. In a context in which the price of bonds rises, the country risk falls and the shares fly through the roof. Despite the attempts of some degenerate prosecutors to sabotage the future of good Argentines. Therefore, in this context, despite the fact that there are still some months of high inflation, it will continue to fall sharply and the end of the cepo will be ever closer. Fourth, we have been able to solve the problem of the debt of importers, which was a sword of Damocles of $42 billion hanging over the heads of all Argentines. As a consequence of all these economic measures, we reached a surplus, both primary and financial, in our first month of government, which constitutes a global record in the history of modern capitalism. And as if that were not enough, we have taken all these measures solely with the resources of the executive branch, without any support from the rest of the political spectrum, except for a few honorable exceptions. But our work is not limited only to the economic. In security, we have inaugurated a new doctrine of public order that no one dared to implement, despite the fact that it was unequivocally the only correct path. First, we began to enforce the law without exceptions. Therefore, we freed the streets from the scourge of constant strikes through our public order protocol. In each and every one of the demonstrations that were called during these almost 3 months of government, and that began as soon as we took office, breaking a record in democratic history. In all of them we maintained order and avoided the indiscriminate blocking of streets through a controlled deployment of security forces. In addition, we are urging the organizations that call for demonstrations to take charge of the cost of police operations. Second, we take care of the victims and those who take care of us. The vile culture of despising law enforcement and crime victims and praising criminals has ended with us. That is why we are promoting an expansion of the framework of legitimate defense and fulfillment of duty, so that citizens who protect themselves or police officers who protect citizens do not end up behind bars, while criminals walk freely through our streets. Third, we are ruthless in the fight against organized crime. That is why, through Operation Bandera, we deployed new federal force personnel in Rosario. And thanks to prevention work, we managed to reduce intentional homicide in public spaces by almost 60% in these 2 months in areas controlled by federal forces. That is why we also created a special management system for high-risk prisoners in our penitentiary system. From now on, they will be controlled by an elite group to prevent them from continuing to commit crimes from confinement, a practice that unfortunately has become commonplace in recent times. Regarding social assistance, we committed to ending once and for all the business of poverty managers, who use the intermediation of plans as a collection mechanism and as an extortion resource to manipulate those who have the least. For this reason, we carried out an audit process of the social plans that showed, as we suspected, that at least 52,000 Potenciar Trabajo plans were improperly assigned to beneficiaries who did not meet the conditions. VIP planners who fraudulently collected money without needing it, many of them while traveling by plane abroad, many with spurious connections in politics. Many public employees whose elimination from the registry resulted in an annual saving of 43,000 million pesos. For this reason, we also implemented the Ministry of Security's 134 line, which helped us uncover the perverse mechanism that the picket organizations use to bring people against their will to the demonstrations, under threat of taking away their plan. We received nearly 80,000 calls that resulted in more than 1,300 legal complaints, and thanks to this system of complaints we discovered the darkest side of this phenomenon. A political gang in Chaco that sexually exploited women and arbitrated their social plans. We are ending the extortion of social organizations towards the beneficiaries. And thanks to the security protocol, implemented by Minister Bullrich, we are also ending the daily extortion that social organizations impose on society every time they block a street. We always said it, in our government, he who blocks does not get paid. But we have the vocation to protect as much as possible the victims of the impoverishing system, which we are trying to change. No Argentine is to blame for the fact that the ineffectiveness and greed of politicians have destroyed their income, and even less so the most vulnerable. That is why we decided to end the system of intermediation of assistance and strengthen the mechanisms of direct assistance. In this line, we have doubled the amounts of the Universal Child Allowance, the pregnancy allowance and the food card. We have also made receiving social assistance compatible with having a salary of up to 1 million pesos, so that those who receive a social plan can reintegrate into the world of work over time. We also absorbed functions that were carried out in an unaudited manner, without registration and without control by social organizations, such as the distribution of food. Now we know exactly what happens with each bag of food that is distributed. In terms of education, we have multiplied school aid by 4 so that families who were affected by drastic increases in this new start of classes can buy the school supplies and materials that their children need. This measure will benefit the families of 7,300,000 children, from kindergarten to secondary school. In an Argentina where children do not know how to read and write, we cannot allow Baradell and his friends to use students as hostages to negotiate wage negotiations with provincial governments. That is why we included education as an essential service in the decree of necessity and urgency. That is why we included education as an essential service in the decree of necessity and urgency, which will take the weapon out of the hands of the unions and force them to provide at least 70% of educational services during any strike. We have always said that we gave the vote to the people not to give us power, but to give it to the Argentines. This crusade begins by reducing the size of the state to its minimum and indispensable and purging it of privileges for politicians and their friends. That is why we went from 18 to 8 ministries, and from 106 to 54 secretariats, reducing hierarchical public positions by more than 50%. That is a chainsaw. That is also why we canceled official advertising in the media for a year. This will result in savings of more than 100 million pesos, if we take as parameters what was spent last year. It is immoral that in a poor country, like ours, governments spend people's money to buy the will of journalists. In addition, we eliminated government agencies such as INADI, which in addition to fulfilling the role of thought police, had an annual budget of 2,800,000 million pesos to maintain militants. Along these same lines, we are going to close the Telem agency, which has been used, during the last decades, as a Kirchnerist propaganda agency. We reduced discretionary transfers to the provinces to a minimum, resources that have historically been used as currency to buy political support. To give you an idea of what this is about, we will update it to today's value. Last year the national state spent 5.4 billion pesos in discretionary transfers to the provinces. Both I and my officials travel on commercial flights and not on private planes as politicians are accustomed to doing, who have a loose conception of what a medical aircraft is for. That is why in the next few days the National Civil Aviation Administration will establish a new regulatory criterion so that no politician or family members of politicians can use private planes, except for strictly official matters. Also, from March 1st, no official who travels with a ticket paid for by a public body can accumulate miles for personal trips, a senseless privilege that perfectly illustrates the caste model. We also ended the festival of official vehicles, which were used by anyone for anything, as if a human resources director needed a driver. All ministries have complied with the mandate to confiscate at least 30% of their fleet. We also eliminated the SIRAS and the non-automatic essence for imports. In this way, We have put an end to discretion and cronyism. Now anyone who wants to import can do so without asking anyone. The era of bribes in exchange for import permits is over. Finally, we also signed a mega decree of necessity and urgency to, for the first time in a decade, return freedom to Argentines instead of curtailing it. Included in that decree were 366 articles that eliminate or modify regulations that hindered the economy, complicated people's lives to protect some privilege, or aggravated the problems they were intended to solve. Among these things I want to highlight: we freed up the choice of social services so that workers are no longer prisoners of the union and its activity, and can choose which service provider they prefer. We repealed the disastrous rental law, and exactly what we said happened. The supply of goods on the market doubled from December to February. Consequently, the value in real terms of rents fell. We also repealed the disastrous supply law, which was a tool that politicians used to extort companies, and we prohibited the power of politics to prohibit exports. We modernized labor legislation to facilitate the hiring of registered employees, something that was fought by unions. However, all these initial achievements represent only the surface of the great changes that we are coming to implement in Argentina. To deepen our mission of ending the privileges of politics and its friends, we are sending to Congress a package of anti-caste laws, of which I want to share with you some of its components. We will eliminate privileged retirement benefits for presidents and vice presidents. We will force unions to elect their authorities through periodic, free elections supervised by the Electoral Court, which will limit the mandates of these authorities to 4 years, and will establish a limit of only one possible re-election. The specific collective agreements made in free association by the workers of a company or group of companies will prevail over the collective agreements of the sector. We will end this madness of imposing on people the working conditions that are defined from behind a desk by a man who has not worked for 30 years. People convicted of corruption, in the second instance, will not be able to stand as candidates in national elections. In addition, any former public official with a final conviction, in the second instance, for corruption crimes will automatically lose any benefits he has for having been a public official. We will drastically reduce the number of contracts for advisors to the deputies and senators of the nation. It has been a common practice in politics for the representatives of the people to create SMEs of 30 to 40 advisors each, squandering the resources of the Argentines. The working day will be deducted from the salary of state employees who do not go to work due to a strike. And in turn, we will eliminate public financing of political parties. Each party will have to finance itself with voluntary contributions from, inaudible, its own members. All serious economists in the world, except for some lapdogs of Argentine politics, agree that financing the treasury with money issued by the central bank generates inflation. This is not debatable. Financing the treasury with issuance is simply wrong, technically and morally wrong. This is so because it generates inflation and because it dilutes the purchasing power of all Argentines, and for what? To put money in the hands of politicians, who do not use it for anything other than their personal benefit. However, in Argentina, we have done it time and time again. And as a result, we are one of the countries with the highest inflation in modern history. With us, it is over. We are going to send a project to Congress to penalize by law the President of the nation, the Minister of Economy, the officials of the central bank and the deputies and senators who approve a budget that contemplates financing fiscal deficit with monetary emission to end once and for all and forever these morally unsustainable and criminal practices. And we will also propose that said crime be at the level of a crime against humanity, in such a way that it is imprescriptible so that sooner or later they pay the cost of their actions. These are just some of the reforms that we are going to implement. We will move forward, whether through a bill, decrees or by modifying regulations, in the most ambitious process of economic regulation in our history. Because if we do not change this economic model from the roots, Argentina has no future. However, all these measures that we have implemented as well as the reform projects that we have promoted have been received with suspicion and distrust by a good part of the Argentine political leadership, not to say with open rejection. What happened with the labor chapter of the DNU and with the law of basis and starting point for the freedom of Argentines, which reflected some of the changes that we want to advance, clearly demonstrates this point. A law that has as its north to re-embrace the model of liberty inspired by the ideas of Alberti of the generation of 37 that comes to liberate the productive forces of Argentines, to return freedoms, to end the privileges and businesses of the caste, was handled and rejected by a part of the political class that resists change. Because we must not deceive ourselves. There is an important sector in the political leadership that does not want to abandon the privileges of the old regime. We saw it in the violent demonstrations in front of Congress, in the declarations of the Unionists who refused to understand that the Argentina of privileges is over, in the actions of deputies who asked for the vote supporting the change, but who tried to betray their mandate while nobody was watching. We also saw it in the reappearance of the writers of failure like Sergio Massa, Pablo Moyano, Juan Grabois and Máximo Kirchner. Even with the reappearance of the former president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who has been responsible for one of the worst governments in history. But we also saw it with journalists, who faced with the decision to end official advertising have decided to come out and defend their privileges in a shameless manner, even falling into crimes of slander and libel and lying in a depraved manner. We also saw it in governors who only care about securing funds so they can continue with the party of public spending. Official advertising, recitals by artists with high cachet and dubious quality, private planes and so many other vices to which politicians have accustomed us for decades. Obviously, there are many actors in the political and economic establishment of the country who do not want to leave behind the Argentina of failure, some for fear of change, others because they are the beneficiaries of this old regime. It is important that society understands that it was the resistance of a large part of politics to give up its privileges that boycotted the law, as was evident when there were 142 votes rejecting the article on the elimination of trust funds. Throughout the negotiation process for the sanction of the law, a sector of the political class became evident that does not understand the historical moment, nor why the people elected us. We did not come to play the mediocre game of politics. We did not come to lend ourselves to the usual give and take, to emulate those politicians who subordinate their projects to the exchange of favors, positions and business. We did not come to do more of the same. We came to seriously change the country. That is why, rather than approve a project emptied of content, we preferred to withdraw it. We do not negotiate change, and we are going to fulfill the promise we made to society, with or without the support of the political leadership. We will do it with the tools that they can provide us, or we will do it only with the legal resources of the executive branch, as we have been doing until now. Because when we encounter an obstacle, we will not turn back, we will continue to accelerate. Now, the reality is that today we find ourselves facing a turning point. The crisis that we have characterized is much deeper than simply material. It is a crisis of horizon because everything that we Argentines have tried in the last 100 years has failed. There are no options left. The logical conclusion is that the only possible alternative is to do something diametrically different or what has been done in the past. That is what we are trying to do. Return to the basics, return to the ideas that made this country great. However, we have encountered an unyielding resistance to make any change. We have found a will to build any reform. Any hint of change that implies a sacrifice for the political class has been rejected. Some because they do not understand the seriousness of the situation in which we find ourselves and cling to past traditions that have only produced failures, and others who resist losing their privileges, their businesses or their comfort. This leaves us facing two possible scenarios. The first is the path we are immersed in, the path of confrontation, that of conflict. That is not the path we chose, and we have demonstrated it by trying to send an ambitious bill to this honorable House, with the expectation that it would be supported. Now, although we did not choose the path of confrontation, we did not escape it either. Because we knew from the day we decided to get into politics that fighting this fight was not going to be easy. I want to tell you, however, that if you choose the path of confrontation, you will find yourself with a very different animal than the one you are used to. Because unlike some of those who are here or those who watch us from their province, politics for us is not an end in itself. We do not live for politics, we do not live off politics. We have no ambition for power. Far from all that, the only thing we have is a thirst for change. We do not make decisions thinking about our political career. We came to raise the flags of freedom, with full awareness that we were going to have to pay the costs of the obscene party that many of you held. Because what moves us is not power for power's sake, but our sacred cause, the defense of life, liberty, and the private property of Argentines. We do not seek or provoke confrontation. We do not want to discuss the past. We have come to propose an agenda for the future. Because as the saying goes, the secret of change is to concentrate all your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new. We have come to put our energy into building the new. But I want to tell all of you who are here and who are watching us that if you are looking for conflict, you will have conflict. Because unlike some of you, who are thinking about your next election or your own interests, we only think about defending the cause of freedom, rebuilding our nation and providing a prosperous future for our children at any price. However, confrontation is not the path we want or the one we choose. There is another possible path. A different path, a path of peace and not confrontation, a path of agreement and not conflict. Agreement, yes, consensus against change. I must be honest in telling you that I do not have much hope that you will take this path. I believe that corruption, pettiness, and selfishness are too widespread. But while I do not have much hope, I have not lost any hope either. In fact, I want you to prove me wrong. I want to challenge you to show that politics can be more than what it is, that we can aspire to be better. To show that despite our differences we can put the interests of the nation before miserable electoral interests. For this reason, and with the hope of being wrong in my distrust of many of you, I want to take this opportunity to extend an invitation to you. Today, at the first opening of our administration, I want to call on governors, former presidents and leaders of the main political parties to put aside our personal interests and meet on May 25th in the province of Córdoba to sign a new social contract called the May Pact. A social contract that establishes the 10 principles of the new Argentine economic order. In this way, I hope that we can leave behind the antinomies of the past, abandon the recipes for failure and return, as our founding fathers did more than 200 years ago, to embrace once and for all the ideas of freedom. This May Pact will ultimately establish the 10 state policies that the country needs to abandon the path of failure and begin to walk the path of prosperity. These 10 state policies are: 1. The inviolability of private property. 2. Non-negotiable fiscal balance. 3. The reduction of public spending to historic levels of around 25% of GDP. 4. A tax reform that reduces the tax burden, simplifies the lives of Argentines and promotes trade. 5. To rediscuss the federal tax sharing and to end the current extortionate model forever. 6. A commitment by the provinces to advance in the exploitation of the country's natural resources. 7. A modern labor reform that promotes formal work. 8. A pension reform that gives sustainability to the system, respects those who contributed and contribute and allows those who prefer to subscribe to a private retirement system. 9. A structural political reform that modifies the current system and realigns the interests of the representatives and those represented. 10. And finally, the opening of international trade so that Argentina becomes a protagonist of the global market again. These 10 ideas, which are the foundations of any nation's progress, can set the conditions for Argentine growth for the next 100 years, so that once again Argentina will be a beacon of light for the West. All politicians are called to support us. We do not care who they are, where they come from, or what ideas they have defended. To show the government's commitment to move in this direction, I have instructed the Chief of Cabinet, the Minister of Economy and the Minister of the Interior to, as a first step before signing the May Pact, call the governors of all Argentine provinces to the Casa Rosada to sign a pre-agreement and approve both the bases law and a tax relief package for the provinces. Once both laws are approved, as a sign of goodwill, we can begin to work on a common document based on these 10 principles previously outlined, so that on May 25th of this year, gathered in Docta, we can begin a new era of glory for our country. This is the offer we put on the table. It will be up to you and the rest of the Argentine leadership to know how to take advantage of the opportunity to change history, or, on the contrary, to try to continue on this path of decadence to which you have brought us. That day we will see who is sitting at the table working for the Argentines and who intends to continue on this path of servitude. I want to be clear about the nature of this call. Our convictions are unalterable. We will put Argentina's fiscal accounts in order with or without the help of the rest of the political leadership. But if the rest of the political leadership supports us, we will do it faster and better, with less social cost and greater cost for those who live off this system. If the rest of the political leadership supports us, the reforms we will implement will have a more lasting character and consequently will generate greater security for local and foreign economic actors, which will result in accelerating economic growth, the reduction of poverty and the improvement of well-being. This historic moment is not for everyone. It is not for leaders who speculate politically. It is not for those who think that governing is a popularity contest. It is not for those who want to maintain their privileges at the expense of a broken country, and it is not for beautiful souls, for whom the forms and commas in a text weigh more than the will to change. It is for men or women of state, for patriots, for those who think about history, who are willing to risk everything for the benefit of the nation, because fixing this country requires enormous sacrifices. We do not govern to be popular. The search for popularity is bad advice for a leader. It is that compass that pushed governments of the last 20 years to postpone measures which, although difficult, were also necessary. We do not listen to those siren songs. We do not govern to be popular, neither today nor tomorrow. We govern for all Argentines, even for Argentines who have not yet been born, so that one day, 30 years from now, when Argentina is a world power, future generations will look back and say, it was there, in La Docta, in our beloved province of Córdoba, that the road to prosperity began. That is why we have a firm hand, because we have a clear direction. That is why we also accept paying all the political costs to achieve these changes, including political costs that are not our responsibility. Because if the price of fixing this country is to fall into ostracism, you will find me there with pride. Because, for us, there is nothing more sacred than the fight for freedom. I look at Argentina and see a country with everything to do, a country rich in natural resources, rich in human capital, and with a spirit hungry for prosperity, but locked up, constrained and repressed by a model that can only lead to failure. We come to give freedom back to Argentines, because only a free society can progress, only a dynamic society that works, employs, trades, produces, imports and exports, without anyone telling it what and how it can prosper. Only by being a free society can we take advantage as a nation of the natural gifts that God has granted us. I look at Argentina today and I am certain that with the ideas of freedom as a beacon, this country still has everything to get back on the path to prosperity. That is why we govern, to make Argentina one of the great nations of the world again, a leader and reference in the region, a productive, agricultural, energy, commercial, maritime and technological power full of life, voracious to populate the corners of the homeland with the frontier spirit that once characterized us. That is the country I dream of and for which I govern. To conclude this message, I say to the governors, the leaders, the different parties of the political system, and to the deputies and senators who are here today, you are facing a pivotal moment in Argentine history. You can cling to an unjust system, of which the great majority of society is a victim, or you can put aside your particular interests and ideological prejudices to collaborate with our mission of change, help us transform the country and go down in history as patriots. If you choose to rise to the occasion and come to Córdoba to sign the Pact of May, both I and the Argentine people will recognize this gesture as an act of humility and courage and a clear sign that we can work together, without rancor. I ask only one thing of the Argentines: patience and confidence. It will take some time before we can see the fruits of the economic recovery and the reforms we are implementing. Furthermore, we have not yet seen all the effects of the disaster we inherited, but we are convinced that we are on the right path because for the first time in history we are attacking the problem at its root. the fiscal deficit, and not at its symptoms. That is why I ask for patience and trust, because no matter how dark the night is, the sun always rises in the morning. King Solomon asked God for wisdom to distinguish good from evil, courage to choose it, and temperance to stay on that path. I ask the same for myself and for all those present here. In this way, the ordinary sessions, number 142 of the Honorable Congress of the Nation are inaugurated. May God bless the Argentines and may the forces of heaven accompany us. Thank you very much. Long live freedom, damn it.